In the summer of 2021, every grain farmer in Lac Saint Jean County was running variable rate application. This was not a choice anymore. It was the expectation, the way the river runs north, and the frost comes in September, whether you are ready or not. The co-ops had pushed it. The agronomists had certified it. The provincial programs had subsidized the sensors and the software and the soil sampling grids, and by the time the canola was going in that July, there was not a single serious operator in the county who would have admitted to spreading fertilizer the old way. Not out loud, not in front of the others. Let me tell you about what happened on the 14th of July that year, because it is the reason this story exists. And it is the reason that one farm outside the village of Hebertville looks different from every other farm on that road today. The growing window in Lac Saint Jean is not generous. You are working in the brief space between a spring that arrives late and a fall that arrives early, and every week of that window has a job. July is the job of side dressing. The canola has been in the ground since late May, and the nitrogen needs to go on before the crop closes the canopy, before the window shuts. Every agronomist in the county will tell you this. They have been telling farmers this for 20 years, and the farmers who have listened have the yields to show for it. The variable rate systems had come into the county gradually through the middle of the 2010s, pushed hard by a Quebec City-based agri-tech distributor called Preci and Agro Solutions, whose regional sales representative had covered Lac Saint Jean since 2016. By 2021, the county's newer operators were running prescription maps built from drone imagery and soil EC data, applying nitrogen at rates that changed every few meters across the field, chasing the variability in the soil the way a doctor adjusts a dose. The system was impressive. Nobody argued that. The yields on the demonstration plots had been real, and the agronomists who had run the trials were not people who invented numbers. On the morning of July 14th, a firmware update pushed overnight to the variable rate controllers on approximately 60% of the county's application equipment, introduced a calibration error that the manufacturer did not catch before it went live. The error was in the section control logic. The controllers were reading the prescription maps correctly but applying the rates at the wrong intervals, overshooting by a factor that varied between 15 and 40% depending on field speed. By the time the first operators were in the field at 6 in the morning, the mistake was already spreading across the ground in stripes that would not show until the crop came in and the yield maps revealed what had been done. The distributor's technical line did not open until 8. When it did, the volume of calls overwhelmed it within 20 minutes. By 9:30, Precision Agro Solutions had issued a stop-work advisory to all clients running the affected firmware version, which was most of them. The application equipment sat at the field edge. The canola stood in the morning heat. The window was open, and nobody was moving through it. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened that morning at the Cooperative Agri Service de Hebertville, because that is where the other part of this story begins. The co-op in Hebertville was not a large operation, but it was the place where the county's farmers gathered when they were not in the field, for seed and spray and the particular kind of talk that happens when men and women who work alone all week find themselves in the same parking lot. On the morning of July 14th, the lot had more trucks than it usually held on a weekday. The farmers who had received the stop work notice were not happy. They were the specific kind of unhappy that farmers get when the window is open and the equipment cannot move, when time is bleeding out of the calendar and there is nothing to do but stand next to a truck and wait for someone else to fix something. Trombley-Fortin was the regional agronomist from Preci Agro Solutions who had driven up from Alma that morning to manage the situation in person. He was 39 years old, had spent 6 years selling and supporting precision agriculture systems across the Saguenay-Lac Saint Jean region, and was good at his job in the way that people who have only ever worked in one era of an industry are good at their jobs. He understood the technology thoroughly. He understood the soil science behind the prescription maps. What he had not spent much time understanding was what you did when the technology was unavailable. Because in 6 years of working in this county, the technology had always been available. He was standing near the service counter explaining the firmware issue to a group of farmers when someone mentioned Annette hand-calibrated. The mention came from an older farmer named Roger Deschens, who had driven past the Poulin-Bedard place on his way into town and noticed something. He said it the way you mention weather, matter of fact, without emphasis. "Annette's been running since 6 this morning," he said. "Saw her going up the north field when I came past." Nicholas looked up from the technical sheet he had been holding. "Which Annette?" he said. "Poulin-Bedard, the place east of the 169, past the old mill." A few of the farmers in the group knew the name. A few did not. Nicholas did not. "She's not on the affected firmware?" he asked. Roger shrugged. "She's not on the system at all," he said. "Never has been." The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Then Nicholas made a short sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. It was the sound of a man who has spent 6 years explaining why the old approach is no longer adequate, encountering the suggestion that the old approach is currently the only thing working in the county. "Spreads by rate chart," Rogers said. "Has since her father ran the place. Same as her grandfather." Nicholas looked around the group. A couple of the younger farmers were smiling the way people smile when something is slightly uncomfortable. A couple of the older ones were not smiling at all. "A rate chart," Nicholas said. He said it the way you repeat a phrase when you are deciding how to respond to it. "You know what the variability looks like in her fields without section control. You know what she is leaving on the table without a prescription map." He said it without cruelty, but he said it with certainty, the way a man says something he stopped questioning a long time ago. He was not wrong about the variability. He was not wrong about the prescription maps. What he was wrong about, though he would not know this for several more months, was the assumption that being technically right about the better system was the same thing as being right about the situation. Let me tell you about Annette Poulin-Bedard before you hear the rest of it, because the story does not make sense without the woman. Annette was 53 years old in the summer of 2021 and had farmed the same 420 acres her father had cleared and tiled on the east side of Lac Saint-Jean over the previous 40 years. Her father, Gerard Poulin, had taken over from his own father in 1978 and had run the operation until his knees and his heart had convinced him to hand it to Annette in 2004. She had been ready. She had been working the ground since she was 12. Not as a child doing chores, but as a learner, asking questions, watching, staying in the field after the work was done to look at what the work had produced. Annette was a reader of soil. It was not a poetic description. It was what people who had watched her work said about her, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with the mild bafflement of people who had outsourced their soil reading to a sensor array and could not quite understand why anyone would bother doing it by eye. She had grown up in a time when the agronomists who came to the county had clipboards and mud on their boots, and she had learned from them the way you learn from people who are standing in the same field. You are. Soil color, soil texture, residue breakdown, drainage patterns, the way water moves across a surface after rain. She had been reading these things for 30 years, and she knew her 420 acres the way you know a face you have looked at every day for most of your life. She had looked at the variable rate systems when they came into the county. She had attended the demonstration at the co-op in 2017 and had listened to the whole presentation and had asked questions that the presenter had not entirely expected about what the system did when the EC data was collected in a dry year and the prescription was being applied in a wet one, about how the algorithm weighted historical yield data against current season variability, about what the margin of error was on the soil sampling and whether that margin compounded through the prescription calculation. The presenter had answered what he could and deferred on the rest, and Annette had driven home and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what she had heard. She had not bought the system, not because she could not afford it, though the full setup, including the drone flights and the annual subscription to the prescription mapping service, was not a small number on a 420-acre operation. She had not bought it because she had looked at it and decided that it was solving a problem she did not have in the way she had it, and that it was introducing dependencies she was not interested in carrying. Her spreader was a 2009 Valmar mounted unit that she had maintained herself since she bought it used in 2013. It ran off a simple ground drive mechanism with a manual rate adjustment, no GPS receiver, no variable rate controller, no firmware. The calibration was done every spring the way her father had taught her, walking the machine across a tarp and collecting the material and weighing it and adjusting the gate until the output matched the rate chart for the field and the crop and the conditions. The rate chart was a laminated sheet that hung on a nail in the equipment shed. It had been updated in her father's handwriting until 2004 and in her own handwriting since then. It had soil zones on it that she had mapped herself over 30 years of observation, not with an EC sensor but with her eyes and her hands, and the records she kept in a log that went back to her father's time. She knew which parts of her fields ran light and which ran heavy. She knew where the drainage was slow and where it was fast. She knew where the canola struggled and where it pushed, and she had built that knowledge into the chart the way a carpenter builds knowledge into a template. She had been running since 6 in the morning, and by the time Roger Deschens drove past on his way to the co-op, she was on her 8th pass of the North Field and everything was going exactly as she had planned it. She did not learn about the firmware issue until her neighbor's son drove his quad out to the field edge at 10:15 and told her that half the county was stopped. She listened to what he said and thanked him and watched him drive away, and then she turned the spreader back into the field. The ground needed what it needed. The window did not care about firmware. Let me tell you about the rest of that day in Hebertville, because it did not end at the co-op. By noon, Precision Agro Solutions had issued a temporary rollback procedure for the firmware, but the rollback required a laptop connection and a specific cable that not all operators had on hand, and the technical support queue for walkthrough assistance was 3 hours long. Some farmers managed to roll back by early afternoon and got back into the field by 2 or 3 o'clock. Some could not get the rollback to complete and waited for a technician to drive out the following morning. The window had lost half a day in the middle of its most critical week, and the farmers who had lost it were calculating what that meant for their nitrogen timing and their canola yields and their input costs, and the numbers were not good. Nicholas Tremblay Fortin drove past the Poulin Bedard farm at 5:30 on his way back toward Alma. He slowed down without entirely meaning to. Annette was on her last passes of the south field, the spreader running smooth and steady behind the tractor, the material going on in the evening light at the rate the chart said it should. He did not stop. He looked at the field for a long moment and then drove on. He thought about what he had said at the co-op that morning. He thought about the word leaving on the table. He was not sure, driving south on the 169, that he had been thinking about it correctly. Let me tell you about the harvest that fall, because the numbers are the part of this story that does not allow for argument. The county average canola yield in 2021 came in at 38.4 bushels per acre. It was a reasonable year, not exceptional, but solid. The farms that had lost application time in July to the firmware issue and had compensated with a later nitrogen timing showed an average yield drag of 3.1 bushels per acre, which the extension agronomist noted in his fall summary is consistent with the research literature on critical timing windows for canola in short-season environments. Annette Poulin-Bedard's canola averaged 41.2 bushels per acre. She had applied on time across all 420 acres without interruption. Her per-acre cost for fertilizer application that season, including the spreader's prorated maintenance and her own time, was $18.60. The county average for variable rate application, including the annual subscription costs, the drone flights, the equipment depreciation on the precision controllers, and the service call costs that July 14th had generated, was $27.40 per acre. The difference was $8.80 per acre across a canola market that was trading at close to $700 per ton that fall, in a year when input costs were being discussed at every kitchen table in the county. $8.80 per acre was not a rounding error. Annette did not talk about these numbers. She knew them because she kept her own records the way she kept everything, carefully and without drama, but she did not go to the co-op and hold court about them. That was not something she did. The numbers moved around the county on their own. Let me tell you about what happened in November of 2021, because it is the turn this story takes that matters most. Nicholas Tremblay Fortin drove out to the Pullum Bedard farm on a Thursday morning the second week of November, after the harvest was in and the fields were bare, and he had spent several weeks sitting with what the season had cost his clients and what it had said about the gap between a system's capability and the system's reliability. He found Annette in the equipment shed doing post-harvest maintenance on the spreader, cleaning the distribution pan, checking the impeller bearings, going through the gate mechanism the way you go through something you intend to use for another decade. She looked up when he came in, registered who he was, and went back to what she was doing. He introduced himself by name and company and said he had been the one talking at the co-op in July. She said she knew. He stood in the door of the shed for a moment. The shed smelled like fertilizer dust and machine oil, and the cold particular smell of bare fields in November coming through the gap above the door. "I said something at the co-op that morning that wasn't fair," he said, "about what you were leaving on the table." Annette set down the brush she was using and looked at him directly. She did not say anything. She waited the way people wait when they have learned that waiting is more useful than filling space. "The system I've been selling is a good system," Nicholas said. "I'm not backing away from that. The prescription maps are real. The yield data is real. A well-run variable rate program outperforms a flat rate in a normal year, on average, across a large enough sample. I believe that." He paused. "But a well-run variable rate program depends on the firmware working, and the connectivity working, and the service support working, and the operator knowing what to do when any of those things don't. And on the 14th of July, none of those things were true for 60% of the farms in this county. Yours ran all day." Annette looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down." There was an overturned feed bucket near the workbench and a stool near the tractor, and Nicholas sat on the bucket, and Annette pulled the stool over and sat across from him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "The system you're selling has a real advantage," Annette said finally. "I know that. I went to the presentation in 2017, and I asked the questions I needed to ask, and I came home and I thought about it for a long time." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "The advantage is real when everything works. What I couldn't get comfortable with was what happened when it didn't." She nodded toward the rate chart on the wall, the laminated sheet with the two different handwritings on it. "That chart is 30 years of this ground," she said. "My father's 30 years in mine. Every time something surprised me in a field, I wrote it down. Every time a zone underperformed or overperformed, I updated the chart. It's not as precise as your system on a given pass. I know that, but it doesn't need a signal, and it doesn't need a service call, and it doesn't go down when someone pushes an update overnight." She paused. "Your system needs three things to work. It needs the hardware to be calibrated, it needs the software to be current, and it needs someone at the end of a phone line when something goes wrong." She looked at him steadily. "My system needs one thing. It needs someone who has been paying attention to this ground long enough to know what it needs." Nicholas was quiet for a long time. Outside, a truck passed on the 169 and the sound of it faded into the distance. "How do you keep the zones current?" he said finally. "Without the EC data, without the drone imagery, how do you actually know where the variability is in a field?" Annette stood up and walked to the shed door and opened it and pointed toward the north field, bare and brown in the November light. "I walk it," she said, "every spring and every fall. I've been walking those fields since I was 12 years old. I know where the clay runs heavy and where the sand comes up. I know where the water sits after a rain and where it drains fast. I know which corners have been short yielding for 20 years and why." She turned and looked at him. "I built that into the chart. The chart doesn't know everything, but it knows what I know, and what I know is 30 years of standing in that specific ground." Nicholas looked at the north field for a moment. Then he said, "That's what the drone imagery is trying to capture. The variability you're describing. That's exactly what the EC survey is mapping." "Yes," Annette said, "it is, and it maps it very well in the year it was collected, under the conditions it was collected." She looked at him. "My map updates every time I walk the field." Nicholas drove back toward Alma that afternoon with something he had not had when he drove out, a specific and honest understanding of the difference between precision and reliability, and of the cost of building a practice entirely around tools whose failure modes you have never had to manage. He did not stop selling variable rate systems. They were good systems, and the county needed them, and a well-run prescription program delivered real value when it was running. But he started having a different conversation with his clients after that November. He started asking whether they had ever calibrated a spreader by hand. He started asking whether they had a rate chart. He started suggesting that they build one, even if they never intended to use it, because the act of building it required them to know their fields in a way the EC survey did not, and that knowledge was the thing that caught you when the system did not. Two of his clients drove out to the Poulan-Bédard farm the following spring and spent a morning in the field with Annette, walking the zones, learning how she had built the chart, watching her calibrate the spreader on the tarp with the same scale and notebook her father had used. She showed them without ceremony, going through the steps in order, answering the questions that came, not volunteering more than was asked. One of those two was a 31-year-old farmer named Patrick Guillemette, who had been running variable rate since his second year in operation and had never manually calibrated an applicator in his life. He asked more questions than anyone Annette had taught. At the end of the morning, he stood in the field and looked at the chart and then looked at the fields and said, "I didn't know they looked like this." He meant the fields. He meant that he had been looking at maps of the fields for 3 years and had not understood that the maps were a representation of something he could also look at directly. He went home and built his own rate chart. He kept running his precision system. He was not Annette Poulan-Bédard, and he did not want to be, but he had a backup now, a real one, calibrated to his own ground, built from his own observation, and he understood how to use it. Let me tell you one last thing about Annette Poulan-Bédard, because the story has one more turn. In the fall of 2023, Annette's daughter Valerie came home from 2 years working for a large grain operation in southern Ontario to take over the day-to-day management of the farm. Valerie was 29 years old and had spent those 2 years running equipment with full precision stacks, variable rate, section control, yield mapping, the whole system that had become standard on commercial operations of that scale. She understood it well. She had grown up watching her mother work, but she had also grown up watching the county move toward precision systems, and she had followed where it went. She sat at the kitchen table with her mother in October and talked about what she wanted to do with the operation. She wanted to add precision guidance. She wanted to bring in the drone imagery service and build prescription maps. She wanted the farm to be running the full system within 2 seasons. Annette listened to all of it. She did not argue. She said, "That all sounds right, do it." And then she said, "But build the rate chart first. Before you put the system in, walk every field this fall and build the chart from scratch. Learn what you're looking at before you let something else look at it for you." Valerie looked at her mother for a moment. She was thinking about the 2 years in Ontario, the thousands of acres she had covered with guidance and prescription, the clean, straight passes that came out of a system rather than out of a driver. She was thinking about whether her mother's request was practical or sentimental. Then she thought about July 14th, 2021, which she had not been there for but had heard about from Patrick Guillemette and from Nicholas Tremblay 14 and from her mother. Quietly, once, without emphasis. She said, "Okay." She spent that fall walking the fields with a notebook and a probe and her mother beside her for the first 3 days and alone after that. By the time the ground froze in November, she had a rate chart of her own, drawn in her own hand, covering every zone of every field on the farm. It was the hardest learning she had done since her first season in Ontario. Not because the work was physically difficult, but because it required her to slow down and look at something rather than measure it, to build understanding from observation rather than from data, to know a thing rather than to have a file that represented it. She had the precision system running by the second season. She used it every day of the application window, and it worked exactly as it was supposed to. But the rate chart stayed on a nail in the equipment shed, and every spring she updated it in her own handwriting the way her grandmother had updated it in his and her mother had updated it in hers. In June of 2025, a connectivity outage at the prescription mapping server took the variable rate system offline for 14 hours during the side dress window. Valerie switched to the rate chart without stopping the tractor. She finished the field before the server came back up. Her rows were on rate, her timing held. The canola did not know the difference. Annette Poulin-Bédard still walks her fields in the evening sometimes, not to collect data but because the ground is something she has known her whole life, and walking it is not separate from knowing it. The rate chart on the nail in the shed has 3 handwritings on it now. The oldest zones, the ones her grandfather first described, are still there in faded pencil that her father went over in pen sometime in the 1980s. Her own additions are in her handwriting, which is smaller and more precise. Valerie's updates are in the margins, in blue ink, dated in the fall of 2023, and updated each season since. The firmware took every variable rate applicator in Lac-Saint-Jean offline on July 14, 2021. One farmer who had never asked a computer for a prescription finished her fields on time, alone, on rate, running a chart her grandfather had started and her father had kept, and she had carried forward for 30 years. Some knowledge does not become obsolete. It waits on a nail in a shed for the morning when everything else stops working. The ground, as Annette Poulin-Bédard has always known, does not care how the rate was calculated. It only cares whether you showed up. I think about Annette standing in that equipment shed in November, holding a brush and not saying anything while Nicholas found his words. She didn't rush him. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that mattered, with the work she'd done in July, quietly, without an audience, on a morning when half the county was sitting in a parking lot waiting for a server to come back online. What stays with me about this story isn't the yield numbers, though they matter. It's the sequence of causes that got her to that morning. Annette didn't finish her fields on July 14th because she got lucky. She finished them because of 100 small decisions made over 30 years, every walk she took through her fields in spring and fall, every observation she wrote down, every time she updated that rate chart instead of assuming last year's numbers were still good enough. The outcome in July was the effect of all those causes. You can't separate them. I've been thinking lately about what it actually takes to build that kind of practice, and I keep coming back to 3 things that don't get talked about enough together. The first is the willingness to do right by the work even when no one is watching. Annette wasn't walking her fields for recognition. She wasn't keeping the chart because anyone was grading her. She did it because it was the honest way to farm the ground she'd been trusted with. That kind of integrity, doing the careful thing because it's the right thing, not because it's visible, is what makes a person reliable when it counts. Nicholas sold good technology, but he'd stopped asking honest questions about what happened when it failed. Annette had been asking those questions her whole career, quietly, to herself, and answering them in pencil in a laminated notebook. The second is what I'd call real intelligence. Not credentials, not the ability to run software, but the capacity to look at something directly and understand it. Annette looked at her fields. She knew where the clay ran heavy and where the sand came through, not because a drone told her, but because she had stood in those spots in wet years and dry years and had thought carefully about what she was seeing. When Patrick Guillemette stood in her field that spring morning and said, "I didn't know they looked like this," he wasn't talking about the fields. He was talking about the difference between a map and a thing. The third is the kind of persistence that doesn't announce itself. Valerie spent a whole fall walking fields and building a chart she wasn't sure she'd ever need because her mother asked her to and she trusted the reason behind the ask. That's not dramatic resilience. It's the quieter kind, doing the unglamorous preparatory work long before there's any evidence it will matter. What Annette understood, and what the story keeps showing me, is that those 3 things compound. The honest practice builds knowledge. The knowledge builds genuine understanding. The understanding gives you something to fall back on when everything else stops working. It's not magic. It's just the natural result of doing the right things long enough, carefully enough without waiting for someone to tell you it's worth it. The rate chart is still on the nail, while Era's handwriting is in the margins now. That's the whole story, really.